All right, welcome back, everybody, to Story Yelling. Oh wait, did I just say
Story yelling?
Story telling.
Story yelling.
I want to do that podcast. It's the same podcast, but we just scream the whole time. Okay, yes, welcome back to Storytelling Deconstructed. Today we have a very special guest, Sheila Jackson. Sheila is a writer who has done a bit of everything. She has a production company called Eve's Lime, and she has two biography collections called Extraordinary People of the Harlem Renaissance and Extraordinary People of the Civil Rights Movement. And today we're going to be talking with her about the movie Parasite. Let's rock and roll. All right, sweet. Before we get started, Sheila, would you mind maybe just mentioning a few of the other things that you've worked on?
It's easy to go down a rabbit hole with me because I have done some of every kind of writing. I have written everything from commercials to history books. I work as a writer-producer. I do a lot of work on the development side and really starting to get back into more producing again as well, and more narrative writing at the same time. So working on my first novel.
Oh, awesome. That's super exciting. Well, we're really excited to have you. Let's go ahead and get started. As mentioned, we are talking about Parasite, which really needs no introduction. But of course, it's by the famous South Korean director Bong Joon-ho. Really took the world by storm when it came out in 2019. I'm going to start out with what I guess has become the traditional first question. What makes this movie great?
The characters. Just really, really rich characters. And it's one of those stories, I think, that has so many layers. It has a lot to say about class and nationhood. You know, it's all about poverty and privilege. The whole thing they did with the American names, you know, calling him Mr. Kevin and the driver. And, you know, it was just very, very well done on every level, I think, just artistically to tell the story and to put those themes out there. So it was something you could relate to, whether you were Korean or American or East or Indian or whatever, you know, because these are things that exist around the world. These are universal issues.
Just to add on to that, I think it was William Faulkner. He said this in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, that the only thing worth writing about is the human heart against itself, as opposed to just purely external conflict between two characters. And that was one of the things I loved about this movie. The characters were not black and white in terms of these are the good people and these are the bad people. When I did some research about the screenwriter / director, because when you see this movie and it's called Parasite and you start to understand why the film is called that, the first thing you think of is, oh, these people are infiltrating this upper class home and they're the ones that are being the parasites. But obviously the same is true in reverse, where they're being exploited by this upper class family. And even though everything seems, they're being very cordial and polite to each other's faces, obviously when they're with their own families and they don't think anyone else is listening and you hear what they're really thinking, you start to understand the moral nuance that each character has. And if I had to define what makes a sympathizable character, for me, that's it. Seeing both the dark and light within their actions. Cody, didn't you say once that you had a professor that gave a definition of sympathizable characters? And it was something to the effect of undeserved suffering?
Yeah, one of my writing professors in college said that his whole thing was he said that the thing that makes a character sympathizable is pity, and pity comes from the recognition of undeserved suffering.
And we know who got the undeserved suffering the most. The brunt of it was the little boy. Oh my gosh. The son in the film.
Oh, yeah. You mean the rich family's son?
Yeah, the rich family son. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he...
Just traumatized. Re-traumatized.
Yeah, traumatized and then re-traumatized. That's right. Just as soon as he had put that other incident to bed, then at the end, it becomes reactivated, so...
Sure. I mean, by the end of the film, almost every character has suffered maybe... at least I think pretty much every character has suffered pretty profoundly by the end of the film. Obviously, it takes the rich people to the end.
Yeah, by the end, the waters are thoroughly muddied, and the people you thought you were rooting for, you're not so sure about anymore, and you really see the whole thing as kind of a moral mess. And any preconceived notions you come into the film having are pretty shattered by the time the credits roll.
Yeah. Even that the rock, I love the symbolic nature of the rock when he said it's clinging to me, that the rock kept clinging to him, the thing that his college friend gave him.
Yes.
Men gave Kiwoo. And I thought that was powerful when he was like, it keeps clinging to me. But it was that love of, or desire for wealth, well, for a better life, not just being money hungry, but it was a whole life that they wanted, you know. I love the way they used the underground, and they literally lived underground, you know, in that basement apartment. And in order to get to the wealthy people's home, they had to go ascend up all of these steps. Even going to the train station was all of these steps going up, and then they had to go up the hill. It was just a lot of great imagery.
Let's talk about that rock for a second. What were they doing with the rock? What was the purpose of the rock? Because it was always obviously serving a very sort of specific purpose on the story, for the story.
Sure. So I wrote a note about the rock specifically because it was so prominent in the symbolism of the film. I tend to not dive too deeply into symbolism. I like the term objective correlative better, just because it just gives like a physical embodiment of some kind of idea.
So as a quick reminder, objective correlative, you want to say really quickly what an objective correlative is?
Sure. I think it was a term that was coined by T.S. Eliot. He was complaining about Shakespeare's play Hamlet and why he thought the emotions of that play were a little muddy. And he said the reason why is because all the emotions were conveyed through text and speech, which is Shakespeare's great gift. But there were no objects that could sort of channel the characters' emotions and make their emotions become something tangible. So he coined objective correlative, objective obviously meaning like an object, and it correlates to the emotion that the character is feeling. So in this case, this rock, it was first introduced by the college student who gave it to the lower class family as
a good luck charm.
As a good luck charm, saying it'll bring you prosperity. And in a way, he was right. I mean, he was definitely right, because it did bring them prosperity, but the family had to make their own luck in a certain way through the plan that is put into action throughout the film. So that's the rock's first appearance, when it's given to the family. And then the quote-unquote prophecy comes true when they do become prosperous. And then I don't think we see the rock again until the storm happens and their house is being flooded underwater. And the rock, I think the rock is one of their precious objects now, because it's become it's become a symbol for their success. And it's one of the few things from the house that the characters decide to save, I believe. And I think that's the second out of the 3 times that the rock becomes important, unless I'm forgetting something.
Was he holding it at the end?
At the very end?
At the very end, I'm trying to remember. Well, toward the end when he was in the hospital when he was laughing.
Because the third time I'm remembering is obviously when the husband of the former maid emerges from the basement. He then takes the rock and bludgeons the main character to near death with it. I think so. Those are the 3 times I'm remembering that the rock plays a huge role in the story.
So it obviously is functioning symbolically, but it's also functioning, like mechanistically. It's all like mechanically in the story. It's the plot pivots around it, at least at the end there.
Yeah.
It's pretty common in stories to have symbols and stuff, but I think it's a really powerful technique that is maybe slightly less common, is to have those symbols also be sort of important to the plot. And like this is just I think that something that like a lot of maybe like beginner writers don't think to do is to like really. And this movie did this a lot, which is to like take things in the world of the movie and like, I can't think of a better word than like reify. It, like reifies them and makes them a thing. So it's like, another example of this is the smell. Smell is a thing that keeps coming back. This idea, this smell, it's a theme that keeps returning, and it's used not just as a symbol. A symbol of the class differences, et cetera, but it's used as a plot device. It's the rich people's commenting on smell is the thing that finally motivates the I can't remember the character's name, the poor husband, to finally get violent at the end, and it's also threatens to expose them when they're hiding under the table.
Yeah.
Yes, I love the use of smell, because it was definitely about to give them away when they were hiding under the table. But the concept of somebody said it, was it the kid that said it? They all smell the same.
Yeah.
And that for me was just such a powerful moment, because there was so much shame in that. And then I think that's when they started using different soaps.
Right.
Yes. That's why I think I like, this is clarifying something in my mind right now on air. This is why I like the term objective correlative better than the term symbol, because I think a lot of writers kind of, especially if you're cynical, you sort of roll your eyes at the word symbol because you always learned about it in English class, and it sounds like this high symbolism. Art, this like artsy fartsy type of thing that only scholars care about, that when you're actually experiencing a story doesn't matter. But an objective correlative means that symbol makes a difference in terms of like the actual plot, and it has an effect on the things that happen. So like the rock, the scholar's rock has this symbolic meaning, but then it becomes tangibly important when the husband of the former maid uses it to bludgeon the main character to near death with it. I mean, it's also because the main character was going to do the same thing to the maid's husband, but he was exposed when he accidentally dropped the rock and revealed that he was coming. And same thing with the smell, where that could just remain purely symbolic meaning, having no effect on the plot. But then in that final moment when the rich father smells the corpse of the former maid's husband, and he gets disgusted, and that really affects the main character's family's patriarch. That's the thing that finally sets him off, and he crosses that line into killing the rich father. Sorry, I also don't know the names, so I'll just refer to them by their role.
So I'm gonna direct this question to Sheila first. Sheila, what do you think that like what lesson could we take from especially this like the use of smell? How like what lesson can we take from how they do that? And you know what I mean? Like how could we generalize that for like our own writing?
I think really getting into the world of the character, like building the characters out. That's what this is to me, that down to what they smell like and down to the smell being impacting their lives and impacting their interactions with other people. They just really built the characters up. And I think that that's what made the film, the characters were so interesting and great to, watch and get into because they had those additional layers, and that's the biggest lesson for me from this. And just in terms of the filmmaking, it was just super thoughtful. Everything was very thoughtful and in line with the class they were from. When they had that big rainstorm and everything flooded, and it was like the wealthy couple had no clue what happened because it didn't impact them. They were living in the shelter. And there was no, are you guys okay? We heard about the flood, or, it was just, can you get over here, for the party, the last minute party. And that big disconnect, I don't know, they just played it out all the way. The characters were just so well developed, and down to the kids, the kids themselves.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe we can get into let's talk about the characters and get into like what makes them, because I agree, they did feel like well-written characters. And I think they were particularly active, particularly intelligent seeming characters. And that's not easy to do, to make. And this is something that like is definitely a pet peeve of mine, is that like a lot of characters don't come across even when they're supposed to, even when we're told that they are like smart. A lot of characters don't come across as particularly smart, and it's kind of maddening. Maybe smart's not the best word to use.
Or three-dimensional.
Sure.
Maybe.
Like, and one of the examples of this that pops into my mind, and I'm actually kind of stealing this example a little bit from Eliezer Yudkowsky, who has a series of essays on what makes intelligent characters, which I think is fantastic. There's a scene from the second Hobbit movie, Desolation of Smaug, where the characters are trying to find the ancient dwarven city of Erebor. So there's like a rock face, a cliff face, and there's like a secret entrance that they're trying to find. And the whole story hinges on this. It's really important. They have this, I think it's a map that has some kind of coded writing on it explaining that the entrance will be able to be found by the last light of the day. And they go there and they try to figure out how to get in, and the sun sets and its light goes down. There's no more light. It's night. And they try for like 5 minutes and then give up immediately and go, oh, well, we couldn't do it. And as Eliezer Yudkowsky points out, that is just kind of ridiculous because if you have half a brain, you're going to put in a little bit more of an effort given how important it is. First of all, you try again the next day, and the next day, and then you'd come back a year later on the same day and try that. Like there would be if you were really an intelligent character, or intelligent person in that situation, really trying to solve that puzzle, you would not behave the way the characters did. They behaved that way because it was expedient for the story, and maybe because the writers thought it would be more dramatic, not because it was the intelligent thing to do. And my point is, not to go on a long rant here, but my point is just that this movie, the characters did a really good job of making them feel active and making them feel like they are each trying to optimize their own life. And they are seeing things and making decisions that we might not have necessarily thought to see or make. And we already mentioned one very small example of that, which was just the little boy when he notices that they all smell the same. Like part of why that's satisfying is that it's satisfying on a thematic level, but it's also satisfying because it's like, whoa, this kid's paying attention.
Yeah. It
means that he has an inner life, that he is noticing the things around him, right?
Yeah. And I felt, they always say good characters, you can get via, the empathy and respect. And I started thinking about the empathy portion. I feel like I had empathy in certain moments with all of the characters except the Mr. Park. I think he was the least likable of all the characters. I don't know. How did you all feel about Mr. Park?
That's the rich father, yes?
The husband, the rich dad.
What made him redeemable in my brain was that he was very nice. So he never went out of his way to be like, I'm above you. I mean, he would do that in subtle ways behind their backs, because I think he's the one who brings up the smell for the first time to his wife when they're laying on the couch, which perhaps that makes him less likable, because I appreciate someone way more if they have a problem with me, they say it to my face. That's kind of, I'm not a huge fan of only talking about people behind their back. I mean, we all do it. I've done it. I try to catch myself when I do it, and it's like, okay, if I'm not going to say it to this person's face, I should probably not say it. So that ending when he was sort of being buddy-buddy with the poor husband, and they were going to pretend to be Native Americans, and it was like, okay, we're going to jump out behind, and it'll be this huge, meaningful moment for the rich son, because he was really into Native American culture. That was charming to me. But yeah, the film didn't go out of its way to make him as well-rounded as the other characters.
Yeah, but his love for family was something that, I think helped make him more likable, because he did love his family.
Yes.
And he dealt with whatever, and his wife tried to make things as nice for him as possible.
Yeah. I agree. That's what I was going to say. His love for his family is... What else, though? Because I feel like there were... go ahead.
I was saying, perhaps the arc that was most fascinating to me was the main son character of the poor family. Because if you had to pick a main character, it's probably him. Either him or the poor father. One of those two is the main character, the protagonist. I'm going to focus on the son. So at the beginning, he has this friendship with someone who's going to college. The main character can't because the family can't afford it. And his friend does him a solid by saying, hey, I have to study abroad. I'm tutoring this daughter of a rich family in English. Your English is also pretty good. Would you mind taking over for me while I'm away? A very, sort of like a Deus Ex Machina approach to getting a plot started, which I thought was interesting. Mm-hmm. And he accepts. And your sympathy is with this guy right away, just because of the circumstances. You see what their life is like for the first 8 to 10 minutes of the film, and it's really heartbreaking. But so you have automatic sympathy for him in terms of the unearned suffering. But that capital is very quickly blown almost immediately, because one of the things the friend who's studying abroad says is, when she's old enough, I am going to try to date and perhaps marry this daughter, and that'll do very well for me. And one of the first things that this main character does is hit on her. Yeah. And then he kisses her. And he doesn't even wait for her to be the appropriate age. He just goes for it. It's like, you made me sympathize with him, and then he immediately becomes this backstabbing creep. Which it was so... that was one of the first moments where I went, this is not going to just purely be a morality play. This is going to be a fully fledged theatrical production where each character has light and dark inside of them.
Yeah.
I always think back to this one piece of wisdom I saw, I think this actually had to do with fantasy magic, but I've seen it other places. I think it's just a general rule, which is that people's weaknesses are more interesting than their strengths. If you just make somebody perfect, they're not interesting. Like, I think in the 1980s, they made Superman so powerful that he could, like, juggle planets, and people tuned out because he was too powerful. He was too good. That wasn't interesting anymore. So it's always the flaws that make people more drawn to a character than their strengths. I mean, obviously, I suppose the real answer is it's the balance between their weaknesses and flaws. But people like to emphasize the weaknesses because a lot of starting writers tend to just be like, I want to just write a cool character, and they're just gonna exude charisma, and they're gonna be the person that everyone wants to be. But that's only interesting for 10 pages. That's not interesting as a fully fledged arc that you want to go through a story with this person.
Yeah. They really made the characters very just in their own worlds where they couldn't even see each other, and then the worlds collided, right? So the man that lived downstairs, nobody even knew he was there for the first half of the film. And you know, the world that the poor family lived in, it was just all so separate, because they even got renamed as they entered the house. They gave them American names. Kiwoo became Mr. Kevin. You know, they just didn't even care about their names or the world they came from or anything. I like how they kept their world so very different and very, very separate. And then when everything collides, you know, when they figure out, when the woman comes to, you know, please feed my husband downstairs, that was so bizarre. That was the most exciting turn to see that not only were they being I thought, well, they're the parasites. The poor family was the parasite, until you realize there's somebody literally living off of this house that you didn't even know was there. That's the parasite.
The most fascinating thing about that moment, especially in terms of the balance between the likability and the dark parts of characters, was this is the first time in the movie after this poor family had success that they are now confronted with another struggling poor family.
Yeah.
And you would hope that in that moment their empathy would be activated. And it's like, oh my gosh, they were in the same situation, and we ruined their lives for our benefit. We intentionally had a scheme to ruin their life for our benefit, and we weren't thinking about that at all. But instead they were just like, they're going to ruin our good thing. We got to remove them from the picture, which that thought is ultimately the thing that flips the tables in an interesting way, but we can talk about that when we're finished with this topic.
Yeah, part of I think you make a really good point, Sheila, that the introduction of the I wish I could. My unfamiliarity with Korean makes it really hard to remember all their names, but it's hard to reference them. So the original housekeeper and her husband, who is living in the secret bunker, the introduction of the husband of the original housekeeper who is living in the secret bunker, it really does add this. It gives this fractal sense, first of all, that like there's like this that it's not just as simple as, you know, the rich people and the poor people and like that's it. It gives a sense that like there's these layers of parasitism, that there's these people are parasitizing these people who are parasitizing these other people who are parasitizing these other people. And it all and in doing so, it does add a lot of moral ambiguity that wouldn't have been there if you hadn't introduced those characters. It's hard to like generalize that though. It's like hard to be like, okay, how can we, like, what is the principle there? It's like, well, the principle is add people secretly living in the basement to every story. It's like, right, obviously that doesn't work. What is the takeaway there?
the takeaway with the reveal?
Yeah, or just so like, let me say it a different way. Like if you were setting out to write this story, right? Like let's say because Bong Joon-ho had a co-writer, Han Jin-won. So if Bong Joon-ho is coming to you with this story and he says, I have a vague idea for a story out for a movie I want to make. It's about a poor family who parasitize a rich family. That's it. That's the idea for the story. Let's write it, right? And you're hired to write this movie. What are the pitfalls that you would need to identify that to avoid? Like, what are the potential pitfalls when you set out to write this movie that could happen, and how do you avoid them? And were they successfully avoided? Like maybe some of them weren't. Maybe this movie made some mistakes.
Sure. This is getting into my answer to the question, what makes this movie great? Which is, this movie is a masterclass in the maxim, show don't tell. Because I think two of the great pitfalls that this movie could have had is lots of exposition and moral preachiness. I think those are the two big pitfalls you could have had, and this movie had neither. So for instance, if I had to briefly sum up the structure of this movie, obviously with the very beginning exposition, you need to show that this original family is in very dire financial straits. And you could say that, but what did they do instead? They dramatize it. They show that they have to steal Wi-Fi from one of the other tenants of the apartment. You show that they keep the window open. They keep the window open when the guy is doing fumigation to be like, hey, if we keep the window open, we get free fumigation. You show that their job, one of the people in the family's job is to fold pizza boxes for a company. It's like all those things tell you that this family is very low class in terms of finances without actually saying that. And all that is through dramatized exposition. So then the next step is the main character gets an opportunity. That's the inciting incident, the call to adventure. The college student comes down from on high to grant an opportunity to the protagonist. Now, I think a lesser... Here, before I explain, let me just reference another podcast we did. When we talked about Better Call Saul, we talked about how one of the common plot elements of that show, as well as Breaking Bad, is they'll very often have a plan that they want to enact, but any other movie, like I think the Ocean's movie do this all the time, where they have a montage, it's like, okay, here's the plan. And then they tell you the plan, and they have like a visual montage of the plan happening as the plan is being explained. Whereas Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad, they just drop you into the plan, and part of the drama of watching it is, as an audience member, is you're guessing, what the hell is going on? And you're trying to figure out what's happening. That's what this movie does. It never shows the family scheming about what they're about to do. It just shows them doing it, and the audience has to catch up. And those two, the exposition of showing their low class and the enactment of this plan, that's arguably the whole first half or so of this movie, or the first act, let's call it. And they never tell you what's going on. It's purely through dramatization that this happens. And I also think a lesser screenwriter would have made what is only the first act of this movie, they would have made that the whole movie. But instead, this twist happens at the midway point that changes everything from there on out. And there's a whole I paused the movie and looked at the time like, gee, the movie must be almost over. No, it was halfway through when the basement was revealed. So here, I'll leave my commentary at that for now. I can keep going on this thread, but I want to get other people to chime in. So I think those are I think those are two of the huge pitfalls that could have happened, but that this movie avoided in a pretty masterful way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that, because it doesn't get preachy at all, but it had so much to say. When it was over, I was just like, wow, this film had so much to say without pointedly, without beating you over the head with any kind of messaging or messages. It was just really watching people react. And as I said, the characters were so well thought out. You're just putting them in these different situations, and left to their own devices, it just unfolds in just a wild set of ways, from some of your characters being killed to, it was just wild by the end. But I like the way that everything changed when they saw, when it was the reveal of what was happening with the basement and her having her husband down there and the Morse code. And it was almost like they got to look into a mirror when they saw, oh, these people were here.
Right.
Being parasites off of the parks. And we thought we were the parasites. We thought we were doing this. And there was a moment of empathy. I did remember something. The wife had something where she was kind of feeling for them and their situation. But yeah, that the whole survival mentality kicked in for them, and it was just them at their worst at that point.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting that the structure of this movie was, as we mentioned, they didn't introduce these other characters who had already been living there, who were a mirror to the main family, until the midway point. So it was like it mm-hmm. set up the whole first half of the movie where it got to the point where it maybe could have been preachy, and it could have been, and then it introduces whole other elements. So, like, I guess if we had to try to derive a principle or generalize that, maybe I would articulate, and you guys can tell me how you feel about this articulation, but maybe it would be something like, moral preachiness can be a big pitfall for a lot of types of movies or a lot of types of stories. And if, that's a risk for your story, like something that you can try to do is, let the story play out until the point where maybe that's a problem. Like, you don't have to modify the whole story, but then introduce an element which complexifies that. And shows it from the other perspective. So the significance of that moment when those other characters are introduced is that it shows us this world from another perspective. Now we're not just looking at it from the four main characters of the main poor family. It's like there's people who have it, and because they're our point of comparison, they have it the worst, and then suddenly we're shown these other characters who mm-hmm. have it even worse, and that recalibrates our sympathy. It's like, oh, this is not the worst it can possibly be. And maybe they're not deserving of every ounce of our sympathy. Maybe we need to reserve some sympathy for these other characters now. And so it's this sort of, in the same moment that Erik was talking about earlier, where the main character, the protagonist, the son of the poor family, kisses the daughter of the rich family, and it feels like a violation to us. And that also is a reversal of we're sympathizing with him, and then it gets flipped on us, and there's a reversal moment where we go, oh, wait a second, maybe that's not how I should have been looking at it. So they kind of set up, it's like a trap almost. They set up the situation where it's like, it's going to be this simple morality, and then they flip it on us, and it makes it interesting, and it makes it rich and deep, and maybe more fun than it would have been if it had just been like complex from the start. Or I don't want to say complex from the start as if it wasn't complex from the start, but equally complex. Like if you hadn't waited to introduce those elements, you wouldn't have got that flip. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. Because they flipped everything into the opposite direction at that point. And when I look at, I always ask myself, especially when films are this long, could it have been shorter?
Yeah.
And, you know, would that have been, was there a way to make this shorter and make it tighter? But I love that they took their time with it to work up to that moment, because I think that's what gave the second half of the film so much. I mean, I was just on like, what's going to happen now? You know?
Yeah, this movie flew by so fast. When it was over, I was shocked because it's one of those things. Maybe this is just like my lack of attention span. Whenever a movie is over 2 hours, I kind of go like, oh man, my brain always goes like, oh, this is going to be work. I have to watch it, sit still and be engaged I have to be engaged with this story for more than 2 hours. But with this movie, the runtime just, it was so pleasurable to watch. I mean, maybe pleasurable is not the right word because there was a lot of suffering, but you know what I mean. It was I was so engaged with the movie.
Yeah, and your mouth's open at the end because it's like, what's going to happen to them now? And you're, like you said, you're watching them respond, but you know the characters so well because they've made them so three-dimensional, and now you're just putting them in these different situations. And it's just like, by the end, my mouth is just wide open, like, oh my God, what just happened?
Cody, would a good way to articulate this principle we're talking about be if you are insistent on having your film have a message, have the message be subsidiary to the characters, not vice versa. Because characters are the things that lead. You must always think of the character.
I mean, yes. I'm just not sure how actionable that articulation is. Like, what does that mean to make the message subsidiary to the characters? Like, the way I would try to articulate it is more something like show the other side. So, and give. So you have to. I mean, I want to use the word steelman, like, which of course is the opposite of a straw man. You have to steelman the other side too. So you want to show the plight of poor people and how it's hard to be poor. It's like, that's great. That's fine. That's nothing wrong with that. But show the flip side too. Show the other side too, which is that like they can also be like, they're not just these perfect angels who everything bad happens to them and they never do anything wrong. Like they are also capable of being vicious and maybe unfair and et cetera, et cetera. And they are also victimizing some people. Like they are being victimized and they are also the victimizers. And like, when you show that flip side too, like they show both sides. They show how they're victimized and how they do have it genuinely hard and their lives and it's tough and they are being victimized. But then they're also doing some victimizing. And by showing that other side, it adds that richness that it's, that's how I would try to articulate it, I guess.
Can we take a moment to track the empathy of what I'm calling this first act from the beginning to when the basement is revealed? I think that might be really helpful because I think they were very conscious while writing this of like when you should start and stop feeling sorry for certain characters. And then sometimes it flips where like at the beginning you don't feel sorry for them, but then your empathy activates at a certain moment. So we already talked about the son of the poor family and how you empathize with him at first, and then the empathy switches when he does the violation where he kisses the underage child of the rich family. Because a lot of this plan that this poor family embarks on is all violations of the initial sympathy we had for them. They are intentionally damaging the lives of people who are in a very similar plight to them in order to get what they want. Because at first you think, because here's where the sympathy lies at first, because you do not lose sympathy for the family when you become aware of the nature of their plan. Because the first moment you become aware of the nature of their plan is when the son is tutoring the daughter in English, and then he says, oh, I know this other person who has a degree from Illinois State University, and she can come tutor your son in art. and then it shows up and it's the sister, and then they're reviewing the backstory, and that's the first moment your brain goes, oh, this is a huge con. I don't know about you guys, I did not lose sympathy for the poor family in that moment. I kind of had a like, fuck these rich guys approach. That was my thought, where it's just like, it's not a huge, it wasn't a huge deal to me. It was only when they started to intentionally ruin the lives of people who are already working for the family that my sympathy started to go down the tubes. So when they planted the panties in the limo, and when they went on this really roundabout scheme to make them think that the maid had tuberculosis and was hiding it, it's just like, ooh.
Yeah.
That was when it really started to tank.
That was sinister.
Very sinister.
That was pretty sinister. I really felt like a lot of that energy came from the father. There was a moment, and I can't put my finger on it. It was early on when they were at the table. I don't know if it had to do with the pizza boxes. It was something that happened that showed me that the father just didn't have empathy or compassion, that he was more hard-nosed.
Are you talking about
everything.
when they're eating he like joking, he pretends that he's about to like hit his wife and he grabs her shirt?
Maybe that was it. But it was something about his manner that showed me that he was different from everybody else in his family, that he was more hardened. Because when I think of what characters had, the son and the mother were the most empathic. The sister had a lot of bravado, but she was still, really good with the kid and super smart. But the dad had a coldness to him. And that to me came through in his work as the driver too. The father had more of a cold nature to him. And maybe that was a setup to lead up to him being the one to kill, Mr. Park at the end.
Well, what's interesting about you pointing that out is this is another great example of just showing behavior and then not having the core reason why that behavior is being done until it's revealed when they're in the shelter. Because I think the core of the dad's character is revealed when they're in the shelter. Their life is not completely in shambles yet because they haven't lost their job, but things aren't going well for them. And he tells his son, have no plan, which sounds like it could be hope-filled advice. But then I think the second half is like, because if you don't have a plan, you won't be disappointed. And it's just like, this is a very cynical and bitter man. And they withhold that for the first 2/3 of the film. You're only seeing it enacted in behavior. So in a way, it's the empathy switch is sort of the reverse of everyone else, where, you're watching a lot of the dad's actions, you're going, this guy's a piece of crap morally. But then you hear him say that in what may be his darkest moment, or his second to most dark moment in the film after, besides killing the other father. And when he's in this dark moment, he finally reveals the core of his being, and that's when the empathy switch turns on. So you're at not having empathy, and then in that moment you're like, he's a human. He's not just a monster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We can probably start moving towards wrapping it up. Maybe we can start to get some set of closing thoughts. Sheila, you've talked a lot about how the characters are really 3D, and I totally agree. How do we write 3D characters? You know what I mean? Like, how do you do that? How do you make a character feel 3D? Do you have any, ideas about how to do that?
I think the best way for me, and what I've started doing, is to really, really journal and write the life story of my characters, to write as much as I can on each character, because then writing becomes more effortless. Like the story almost writes itself because your characters are so fleshed out that you just have this situation you're putting them in, and you know how each one is going to react because you've really looked at and developed who they are, what their misbehaviors are and how they would respond in certain situations. But once you have fleshed those characters out, I think it's the really writing the backstory and really getting into coming up with some interesting things about the backstory, some great set pieces from their backstory, or, and really, really putting together something compelling for each character.
Is there a moment that you can think of from this movie that really sort of implied a rich backstory? Do you know what I mean?
I was going to say, really, the main character, Ki Woo, Mr. Kevin, from his conversations, I just really got that he had lived a double life almost with the exposure he had through men, even just through the conversations with men. And I just felt like I knew a lot about him and his aspirations to achieve these things and be the person that was responsible for his father's hopes and dreams. Even though he never said that, there was just something in how it was written and in his manner and in the way he carried himself that he really felt responsible for his father's hopes and dreams, that he had seen a little more of the world than the rest of the family, even though those stories weren't there. But it was just even the mere exposure to men that suggested all of that, and the kind of different conversation, the fact that he spoke great English, it just lended a lot to, there's a lot more to his backstory.
Sure. Yeah. And you talk about Min, being his friend, the college friend. Yeah.
The college friend. Yeah. It might take it in a different direction, but I just had a question for you guys. Why do you think that Mr. Kim killed Mr. Park?
Sure.
That was such a bold, huge thing to do. Just such a big no. It was like no.
Here's what this film does a great job of doing, and this gets into how the second half of the film really recontextualizes the whole movie after the basement is revealed. Because what that moment does for me as an audience member, and what this beat is supposed to do, if anyone else were writing this movie, is it would have showed the original poor family the consequences of their actions. They are now seeing what happens as a consequence of them ruining this maid's lives. And you would hope that the empathy switch would turn on in their brain and they would have that moment, oh my God, what have we done? But they don't have that moment.
Right.
And instead, and as the maid is begging the mom, who is the only person the maid thinks is in the house, to not reveal the secret, the mom's like, I don't know. Like, she has all the leverage. But then as soon as the whole family stumbles and they're revealed, the tables flip. And now the maid and her husband have all the leverage, and they sort of, and they manipulate this poor family for their amusement. And so what's happening there, and why this is such a great morally nuanced movie, is it shows that anyone who gets a taste of financial prosperity will behave the same way as the people they originally hated. If I had to extract like a main nuanced message from this movie, that might be it. Where it's like, at first you're like, yeah, screw this original rich family, they deserve to be leached off of. But then you realize with the two lower class families fighting amongst each other, it's like, they're not better. Like, as soon as any of them are on top, if the tables flip, it's going to be them. But they still have inside them that resentment that they had for the original rich family, as is revealed with the conversation about the smell. So it's this really nuanced tapestry where it's like, yeah, I still have resentment for anyone who's above me, but as soon as I'm above someone else, I will treat them the same way that I hate being treated. And that battle inside is, so Mr. Kim, he's the father of the poor family, right? So Mr. Kim, I think that battle, like, it was always like 50-50 which one was going to win. And in that final moment when the rich husband smells the maid's husband as he's dying on the ground, finally one of those sides, like, something had to give. And it was the resentment for people who think they're above you. And that's, in my opinion, that's what put him over the edge and made him stab.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. And what's ironic about that is that what that essentially means is the sort of the message or the theme. What that means is that the environmental circumstances of a person's life matter more for how they behave than who they are, like, on the inside. And that if that people are somewhat interchangeable, and that if you put anybody in this situation, they'll behave a certain way, and you put anybody in a different situation, they'll behave a different way, which is in the exact opposite of, like, rich 3D characters with internal lives, which is what we've been talking about this whole time. So, and not that those, and I don't say that to mean like that, therefore that invalidates everything we've been saying and we're dummies. Like, no, that's an interesting depth to the movie, that, yeah, I don't know if I have anything more to say about it than that, but that's just sort of an interesting thing, which is that, like, they wrote interesting, deep characters, and then the point of the movie was kind of like, and yet, like, that's an illusion, kind of, and that actually their interestingness and their depth would not change how they behave if their circumstances were different.
Right. I wish I could attribute this phrase to someone, because it's so great. I've never heard it articulated before like this, where what this film is essentially saying is most people are kick down, kiss uppers. So anyone who's beneath you, you treat them with contempt. But if anyone's above you, then you mollycoddle them, you flatter them, and it's that hypocrisy is just so gross and disgusting. So in a certain way, when Mr. Kim finally killed the guy, I had a little more respect for him, where he's just like, you know what? This isn't worth it anymore. I'm just gonna go for it. You know, because finally he's not a hypocrite. He's revealing who he really is. It's like, oh yes, that.
Be who you are. Embrace the fire.
Be an authentic person.
Be authentic. But it's interesting because it was a bold move. The first time I watched it, I was so shocked. I was like, oh my God, why would he do that? I was like, no. It was just, but the other guy who had been living downstairs, the husband who had been living down there alone all those years, he was so humble and thankful in that kind of, from that kind of poverty space of, just God bless Mr. Park. It was just such a opposite kind of thing. And that he was so, like, Mr. Park was a God, and he's so thankful to him for letting him kind of leech off of him all of this time. It was such a interesting juxtaposition, looking at the difference between the two of them. But in the meanwhile, Mr. Kim had contempt, for Mr. Park.
Yeah. I hadn't thought of that. That husband, the maid's husband, really had formed kind of a cult around the rich husband as like his benefactor. Yeah. And I hadn't thought of that. That's such a cool little tasty tidbit that I missed.
Yeah, because I just remember the way Mr. Kim looked at him when he was saying that, and he was doing the Morse code with his head. you know, the thing that he did every night with the Morse code, which was so sad. That was such an interesting element.
Yeah, was it a prayer of thanks that he was sending over Morse code?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was like, but yeah, so many great little elements like that, little elements of storytelling that were more, you know, things that take you more windows into the characters, you know. It was just great. But yeah, that ending was just, it was so shocking to me the first time. And it was just as dramatic the second time. But it was so cool how at the end, the son decides, you know, next time I am going to make a plan. And he's saying his plan that he's going to go to school, get a great job, make money. Just he's going to do things the honest way and come back and buy that house. And that was him making the plan at the end, you know.
Yeah, and the overtones at the end are just like, that's pure fantasy.
Yeah.
Doing it the honest way, it's just like, there's no chance that it'll ever come to fruition, which, yeah, it left an appropriately bad taste in my mouth, is a good way. It was very effective.
How did you feel at the end, though? What do you think the tone was at the end? Because it was like, this is not real. This is, you know, I don't know. I had mixed feelings at the end.
Well, because the movie ends with two messages, one of which is the father sending the message that he wrote through Morse code, hoping one day his son will see it, which one day he does. It doesn't specify how long it took for the message to be received. And then the son is writing a message telling him about his plan to work his way up and eventually have enough money to buy the house and thus free his father. But because it shows that happening in a dream sequence, but then in the end when you see it's just in his imagination. He's really not anywhere even close to enacting it. So in a way, like when they show the visual, you think like, oh my gosh, he's doing it. But then they take it away.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, it was all just a fantasy. And that left a huge, it was pretty emotionally devastating where it's just like, ooh.
So I wanted to break. So we've been bouncing around a bit and kind of talking about a few different topics, but something that we keep coming back to is that the characters did feel well written and they felt rich and they felt intelligent. And Erik, earlier you mentioned the mystery plan technique, which we did talk about in a previous episode when we talked about Better Call Saul. And in that one, in Better Call Saul, we just kind of talked about it as like just this standalone technique, that it's just a thing that you can do, and where the characters just start enacting a plan before the audience knows what the plan is. And it just creates mystery and interest because you're trying to figure out what's happening. And that's definitely true. It works on that level. But I think this movie really showed that what it also can do is so earlier I kind of posed the question of like, how does the movie show intelligent characters? How do you write intelligent characters? And I think this is one of the ways. This is one of these techniques that can make your characters feel active and intelligent and self-actualized, which is to like, there's this kind of this paradox where on the one hand, there's this idea of like tracking, that a character's motivations and their decisions should track. And if they do things out of nowhere, out of the blue, that don't track, that like that's bad. And that's something that's kind of taught in writing books and stuff, and is a classic way but on the other hand, when you understand every single thing that your character does, and you feel like it can make them feel like 2D and boring. And so there's this actually, it's actually a really effective technique, I think, where having the characters remain, not necessarily all the time, but at least for sometimes, have them remain one or two steps ahead of the audience, which is the opposite of dramatic irony. Dramatic irony, of course, is when the audience knows more than the characters, which can have its place too. But having the characters be a step ahead of the audience, where they are doing something and we don't know what they're doing until we kind of figure it out, is a really effective way, I think, to make your characters feel intelligent and make them feel like they are picking up on things. They are picking up on and responding to things in the world that we aren't seeing yet, right? So they're seeing an opportunity in their world that we don't see yet, and they're acting on it. This is most effective, I think, earlier in the story. These are opposite principles. That's my point I'm trying to make. These are opposite principles. Your character's actions should track and make sense versus they should do things that are surprising that we didn't see coming and that we couldn't understand before they did them. Those are literally the exact opposite. But they're both can be good. How do you know when each one is good? Generally speaking, I think, and you guys can tell me what you think about this, earlier in the story, it's better to have your character do surprising things that you didn't see coming, because that tells you something about who they are, and it tells you something about what's going on inside of them. That must mean, because if they're just purely responding to circumstances, and they're just responding to what's happening in a way that is obviously and immediately legible, that we can obviously understand, it's like, yes, I would have done the same thing in that situation. It's understandable and it tracks, but it's boring. Or not, it's not boring necessarily, but it doesn't tell you anything about who they are. It's like, they're just responding to situations. It's not telling us about something, what's inside their soul. So earlier in the story, it's more interesting to have them do surprising things because that tells us who they are and what's in their soul. And then later in the story, if they just respond to the circumstances around them, it's like, okay, we already know who they are, and now the plot is what's carrying them, and we're caught up to the plot.
Right. Well, especially in this story, when the first part of this movie is them enacting a plan that affects other people's lives, and then the second part is like, how do their actions it's showing the consequences of their action, even if they don't care about the consequences of their action. Because like the difference is, at the end, you need Mr. Kim's murdering of the other person to make sense. That is not a story beat you get to yada yada yourself out.
Right.
You need that to make sense. Whereas at the beginning, if you need the audience to play a little catch up, to be like, and part of the catch up is being like, oh, these lower class people are more morally devious than originally thought. Yeah, that's fine. But you need the murder at the end to make sense, especially since it's such in general, you want the more a story beat affects future events, the more you need it to make sense at the time. So you need the ending murder to make sense because it's a huge moment. You need the reversal of fortunes that happen once or twice in the middle of the movie, when at first the maid is begging the mom to not reveal what's happening, but then when her whole family is revealed, then that reversal of fortunes, you need that to make sense at the time because it changes everything that's going to happen in the future. So you need the audience to understand that immediately.
Yeah, but I mean, like, all the things that they happen in the beginning of the movie also affect everything later. And like for example, the decision of the poor son, his name is Kiwoo, to his decision to, for example, like infiltrate this, to take this job and help his family infiltrate the household of this rich family. That's a decision that is essentially entirely comes from within. And
well, yeah, but as you're saying, it's about the accumulation of time. Like,
yeah, well, that's my point though, is that it's because you're saying what determines it is how important the decision is, and I'm saying it's not how important it is. It's literally just where it comes in the story. It's like if it comes earlier, it's okay for it to be more mysterious. If it comes later, you have to understand it entirely.
But at the same time, here's what I'm saying, because I think there's a miscommunication. Because what I'm saying is, like, even if the story's like that murder at the end could not have happened at the beginning of the story, because you don't have the accumulated knowledge about the character for that murder to make sense.
I mean, I see what you're saying, but like there are stories that start with murders, right?
Yeah, there are, and those murders don't mean as much to me.
Absolutely, but then that's not the point. Like, the reason that works is because that murder that the story starts with is not the point of the story. So like, it's just a setup, and it says, okay, what comes after that?
But you're saying that when things happen that are surprising like that, it's giving you the window into the soul of the character.
Yeah.
And that needs to happen early on.
Yes.
So that we can get to know the characters in that way.
Right.
Right. Because, like, the enacting of the plan, which shows the moral nuance of the characters, that did not strike me as like a quote unquote twist. It was just like it still came across as like expositional to me, because I was still learning who these characters were.
Sure. But it's still in the sense of, it's still kind of like a surprising decision to make. Like, not everybody, like, it still tells us a lot about who they are, because in the sense, right, like let me give you an example, right? Like, it's
Yes.
not like it's not like the university friend said, hey, you know what you should do? Your whole family should pose as various people and infiltrate their household, right? That idea was not suggested to them.
Right.
They came up with that elaborate scheme all on their own. And it's kind of surprising when you find out what their scheme is. You're like, holy shit, they're going to try to go, like, that's their plan and they're going to go through with it, right? Like, it's kind of like a crazy thing to do. And when you find that out, it doesn't track. It doesn't track at all. Nothing previously has given us any indication has given us any idea about, like, has seeded that idea at all, right? It's a completely new idea when it's introduced. And and that's effective, and it works, and we like it, and it feels really good, because it feels good precisely because it doesn't track, precisely because it's new, and that means it's telling us something about who these characters are, right?
Right. It's still in the category of like exposition, where it's like you're learning about the characters. But yeah, like once the characters are solidified in that first half of the movie, then as you said, from then on, it does need to track, even if the things they do are shocking.
Sheila, what do you think about this?
What do I think about it?
Yeah.
I think that I kind of agree with Erik in that you want it to make sense by the time you get to the end. So you're doing kind of a tracking or a build up, a dropping breadcrumbs along the way in terms of the character and how the character's unfolding. I don't know. I like the way that, to me, with this particular story, all of the characters, I can't say they all had well, they all kind of did have a resolution at the end in terms of how the story, well, some of the resolution was just death, but
for most of them.
of them. But I don't know. Am I answering the question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer. It was just like, because I guess what Erik and I are kind of like, debating about or going back and forth on is what determines whether or not an action has to be fully understood and explained when it happens.
Yeah. Yes. At the time.
Yeah, as if you're going to get the other. Yeah, if you're going to get the other piece of it down the line, or it's going to make sense. I think that's what makes for a great tight script too. Like, you almost could have written it backwards, because you know that you're going to, to have the resolution or the further reveal, on whatever the little breadcrumbs are that you're dropping, or the foreshadowing or windows or all of that is going to actually lead to something. And I think that's what makes a film more satisfying, is when those things actually lead to something. It makes it more satisfying for the viewer.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, where like, if in that crucial second half of the movie, if you're doing things that don't feel like they track with the character at the time, I think a good principle is it has to have the promise that it will be revealed. And as far as how you do that, like, as a, like, it's like, say, a principle of like how you do that, I might need to think about that for a sec.
Yeah, because you don't want your viewer or reader to feel lost by your
It's a
story
careful it's a careful balancing act. And yeah, I think especially because yeah, Cody, I think essentially we're agreeing because the main point is like as I think you agree that as the story goes on, it becomes more crucial for things to track later.
Yes.
But if you're not going to, then what Sheila says is correct. Where it's like it needs to have embedded in the moment the promise that it will be revealed.
Yes.
Okay, like off the top of my head, a cheesy way of doing this would be where I think this happens in a lot of movies where in that second part there'll be some twist and then the plot will keep going and then in the final moments of the movie you'll have a flashback to right before that moment that didn't track and that will clear it up. Which not the best way to solve the problem, but that is one way off the top of my head.
Yeah, I don't know why this is like the example that I think of right off the top of my head of something that kind of does that is in Django Unchained when they're chasing down the first three bounties. I think they're called the Riddle Brothers or the something like that. There's right before they catch, like there's no explanation of who these people are or what. And then right before they catch them, it does a little flashback to show that these guys whipped Django's wife. And so he has like a history with these people. And then like moments before he catches one of them and kills them. Which is like not necessarily bad, but and it's effective on an emotional level because it happens right before, and so it's fresh. The emotions are fresh. But it's definitely not like set up previously. It's just like a quick, like, oh yeah, by the way, this is why this matters. Okay. Which is, I think, kind of what you're talking about, Erik.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to add one other thing that's off topic. You may drop it back in an earlier thing because I was looking at my notes and remembering that because I just feel like that dad was such a compelling character.
Yeah.
His son asked him at one point if he thinks he fits into the setting in the house that they're in. And I don't know if he ever answers, but I think that he had a look on his face like he was just reevaluating whether or not he even thought that he was fit to be a part of the life that he aspired to. And I think maybe that's why he killed Mr. Park. I don't know if the dad ever felt that he could even, the smell was something he couldn't get off of himself. Yeah. It had become a part of him. And this is just, even if he aspired to this wealth or this life, but he wasn't even fit to be a part of it.
I was thinking a lot about the American dream while watching this movie, because in America we have this idea where it's like nothing intrinsic to you I should say nothing external to you should matter, whether it be your original station in life, your religion, the color of your skin, whatever it is. In America, that's not supposed to matter. All that matters is, do you have some kind of idea that will improve people's lives? And if so, like prosperity will come to you. And I don't know if they have an idea of like being able to change your station in South Korea. From what I know about the country, I feel like that's an idea that very much exists in their culture as well. And it felt like connected to what you're saying, Sheila, that there was a sense of like hopelessness in this movie where it's like, you can't overcome your station. Like the smell, it's like, that's just in you. And even if you put on a fancy suit and become like, it's just in you and you can't get rid of it. And that's a pretty fatalistic and devastating idea to really have it dawn on you fully.
Yeah.
And I think that might be what dawns on him in that moment when he's going to murder him. He's just like, yeah, it's just like, I will never not have this smell. So I can never be him, no matter how much he's nice to me and we play buddy-buddy. There's this great line earlier in the movie. I think this is when the rich people were camping and they were talking about how nice the rich people were to them. And the mom says, she said something to the effect of, rich people have no resentment. If I was rich, I'd be nice too. Money irons out your resentment.
Yeah. I remember that line.
Oh my God. The funniest part of the whole movie is when the maid and her husband were making the other poor family do stuff, and then she does that impression of the lady in the pink dress praising Kim Jong-un.
Oh, yeah.
I laughed so hard during that scene because it was one of the most intense moments dramatically of the movie, where, like, regardless of whether you still sympathize with the poor protagonist family, there's still the protagonist, and there's sort of your consciousness, your window into this movie, and you're like, oh my God, it's going to be over for them, like, now. And especially when they get the phone call that, oh, hey, our camping trip was cut short, we're coming home right now. You're like,
we're coming home in 8 minutes.
Right. Not only are you coming home in 8 minutes, but we want you to have this specific meal ready. It's like, oh my God, we got to clean up all this stuff and, like, get this meal ready in 8 minutes. Yeah. So that humor in that moment was just very well timed. It's like right at the exact moment you needed it.
Yeah, they did balance out kind of the humorous elements. It's kind of like, I don't know, I think about Succession, because Succession, you know, the HBO series, it's a drama, but it has a lot of comedic elements. And, you know, with Adam McKay and Will Ferrell doing a lot of that writing. And I think that's kind of how this was for me. It had comedic undertones. I didn't feel the heavy drama of watching it, of course, until the end, with all the bloodshed and the violence that took place in the second half and at the end. But I wasn't sure how to feel about it at certain points, because I was having a really full tilt experience emotionally, you know. And like you said, liking the characters, then not liking them, then, you know, just falling in and out of love with everybody, and just the different things that were happening. There was a lot going on in that film, and lots of characters. So it was a lot to balance.
It really says a lot how you would think that having the constant switching of whether or not you empathize with a character would be, like, emotionally exhausting. Mm-hmm. And it was, but it was rewarding. Yeah. Like, which usually emotional exhaustion is something you want to try to avoid. You don't want to push people's buttons too much, or else they'll stop. They'll just shut down and stop caring. Yeah. But in this film, it was really effective.
It was a wild ride. That's what I call the wild ride films, that just take you on a journey all over the place.
I only have one criticism of this movie, and it was that too many crucial plot points hinge on people stumbling.
Yes.
I got sick of that.
Falling down the steps and...
Falling down the stairs, where the whole dynamic flipped when the whole family stumbled and the maid caught them on film. They fell back into
poverty.
Yeah, that's right.
Those stairs were a device, just like the stone, because they're falling down the steps back to the basement.
Right, and yeah, when he was going to bludgeon the maid's husband with the stone, and then the stone falls... There's a principle in writing that I've heard where, because you want to try to have your plot hinge very little on coincidences, but what the wisdom is, if you need a coincidence, it's better if it's bad for the protagonist, which in this case both of them were. Mm-hmm. But it's just one of those things where it's like, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, come up with a better plot device. Come on.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that one before, actually, and I disagree with that. I don't like coincidences in either direction. And the way we've talked about this before is that we said that there's three tiers of flaw, and there's, like, the accidental mistake, that's the lowest one, and then the middle one is the one that's like, if it's like a habit or an unconscious behavioral pattern, or like a trauma-induced reaction formation or something like that. Like, it's a part of their character, but it's not really, like, conscious. And the highest level is when it's a conscious philosophical belief that they hold explicitly. And higher is better. Like, it's better to have things pivot around conscious philosophical beliefs that the characters have. That's high drama. And when things just happen by mistake, they just, oops, that's really unsatisfying.
Yes. So that is, because that's something I also try to think about when watching a movie or reading a book is, could I have improved it? And in order to do that, you should have to look for things that you think are wrong. And maybe it says a lot about this movie that this was the only thing I came away with. It's just like two stumbles that are plot hinging. Come on. That's all I got in terms of critiques. The last thing I want to say is the South Korean film industry is the master of the plot twist. Every single movie that I've seen that's blown up out of South Korea does this amazingly. I'm thinking of Old Boy. I'm thinking of The Handmaiden. And yes, also this movie, where either halfway through or at the very end, they did a fantastic job of planting the seeds throughout however long before the twist is revealed. They need to plant those seeds for it to make sense and not just be like the ending of Lost, where it's just like, you didn't expect that to happen. It's like, yeah, I didn't expect it because you didn't plant it at all and it sucks. The South Korean film industry, I don't know if they have a name for it. It's not Hollywood. Whatever their name for it is, they are amazing at that. And because I remember in college, a lot of people think a plot is a twist. Like that's what their whole plot leads to, is like trying to come up with this insane twist. And I'm personally of the opinion that if you have a reveal that's going to happen and the audience can predict it, but it's mind-shattering and it's awesome, do it anyways. It does not matter. Like, the audience will forgive you for the predictability of it if what the thing is cathartic. But if you think a twist is essential, I think these movies coming out of South Korea are essential masterclasses to watch. They do an amazing job of planting seeds throughout the movie and having the turn make sense. And it really is, it does what a twist is supposed to do. It shatters your mind. And yeah, I don't know if they all learned that in film school over there, but they're teaching the right lessons.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's all I got.
Yeah, I agree. Awesome. Before we wrap it up, well, let me just say, first of all, thank you so much for joining us, Sheila. We really appreciate having you here and hearing your insights.
Yeah, thank you.
We're not the biggest podcast in the world, but we love to do what we can to get the word out on what you're working on. Can you mention some of the stuff that you're working on these days?
Actually, I'm working on a couple of projects. One about Desmond Tutu, the life of Desmond Tutu, and another project about a civil rights activist who is kind of unsung, Reverend James Lawson, who actually is the one who really mentored Martin Luther King about peaceful protest and Gandhi and the teachings of Gandhi and that sort of thing. So working on a couple of interesting projects.
Sweet. Where can we find those? I would love to check that out as well. I'm interested in that as well. Where can I find that?
I will keep you posted. We're just starting with the Lawson project. We're just beginning. We're in development now. And the Tutu film will be out sometime next year.
Okay. Awesome. Well, yeah, definitely. Please do let me know when those are available so I can check them out. And is there anything that you have out now that we could mention?
Actually, I have a podcast called The Good CEO, and I do a lot of social impact strategy with people. And during COVID, I decided to focus my energies, since film wasn't really happening, to focus on corporations and entrepreneurs and smaller businesses. So I do a lot of, you mentioned consulting earlier. I consult with people on how to create a social impact strategy for their companies. And The Good CEO is a podcast where I interview specifically women founders who have achieved that with their companies. So we talk about different tools, resources, and approaches to building, to having just a mission beyond the bottom line. I call it aligning profit with purpose.
Sure. Okay, cool. So it's called The Good CEO.
Yeah, and it's on all platforms. You can find it on Apple, you can find it on Spotify, and any other platforms where quality podcasts are found.
Sure. Your local podcast grocer.